In 2008, a man named Daniel worked as a mid-level manager in Phoenix. He earned just over $82,000 a year. Nothing extraordinary. Same salary range, same career path, same timeline as thousands of others around him. His neighbor Mark earned almost exactly the same. Same industry, same experience, even started in the same year. On paper, they were identical. But here's where it breaks. By 2022, Daniel had over $310,000 saved. Mark had less than $9,000 and $27,000 in debt. Same income, same city, same decades, completely different outcome. And it wasn't because one of them invested better. It wasn't because one got lucky. It came from something far more uncomfortable, something so small, so ordinary, that neither of them ever thought it mattered while it was happening. If you follow this all the way through, you're going to see a mechanism that doesn't just explain this story. It explains why most people work for decades and still end up with almost nothing left. Not because they failed, but because they never saw what was quietly shaping the result. At first, nothing about Daniel's life looked different. He didn't earn more, he didn't take bigger risks, he didn't have access to better opportunities. From the outside, there was no signal that his outcome would be any different from Mark's. That's what makes this difficult to see. Because the divergence didn't start with a major decision, it started with things too small to question. Choices that felt reasonable, normal, even responsible. The kind of decisions no one warns you about. And more importantly, the kind of decisions that don't feel like decisions at all. They feel automatic. Daily routines, default behaviors, things repeated without attention. And this is where the pattern begins. Not in what they earned, but in what happened after the money arrived. Because income, by itself, doesn't determine direction. What matters is what the system does to that income over time, where it flows, how quickly it leaves, what it gets converted into, and what it never becomes. And at this level, Daniel and Mark were not the same. They just didn't realize it yet. If you isolate a single decision, it doesn't look like much. A slightly higher payment, a more convenient option, a small upgrade that improves your day. On its own, it's invisible. That's why most people never question it, because the system doesn't apply pressure in one place. It distributes it across time, across habits, across decisions that feel unrelated. And when you zoom out, that's where the distortion appears. The average household doesn't struggle because of one catastrophic mistake. It struggles because of accumulation, not of wealth, but of commitments. Small, recurring obligations that attach themselves to income the moment it arrives. And once they attach, they don't leave. They repeat, monthly, automatically, quietly. Which means over time, less and less of what you earn is actually available to you. Not because you spent recklessly, but because the structure was already in place. And this is the part that almost no one calculates. Not what things cost, but what they continue to cost long after the decision is made. This is where the difference begins to take shape. Not in a dramatic way, not in something you can point to and say, that's the moment everything changed, but in a pattern, one that repeats quietly across different parts of life. Take something simple, transportation. Not as a symbol of status, but as a system of cost. For Mark, upgrading felt natural. A newer car, a smoother drive, a monthly payment that seemed manageable. Nothing excessive, nothing irresponsible, just better. Daniel made a different choice. Not because he couldn't upgrade, but because he didn't need to. And that difference didn't show up immediately. In fact, at first, Mark's decision looked like the better one. More comfort, more convenience, more visible progress. While Daniel's choice looked unchanged. And that's what makes this pattern dangerous, because in the short term, the option that costs more often feels like the one that's working. But underneath that surface, something else is happening. One decision is creating a recurring pull on future income. The other is leaving that income unclaimed. And over time, that gap doesn't stay small. It compounds. Not all at once, but in a way that becomes impossible to reverse once it's fully formed. And it doesn't stop at one decision. That's the part most people underestimate. Because once a pattern forms, it doesn't stay isolated. It replicates across different areas of life that seem completely unrelated. Food becomes convenience. Instead of planning, you decide in the moment. A quick purchase here, a small upgrade there, nothing that feels significant. But each choice removes one layer of friction. And friction is what used to slow spending down. Then it moves into routine. Coffee outside instead of at home. Meals bought instead of prepared. Subscriptions that renew without being noticed. Each one small, each one justified, each one easy. And that's exactly why they accumulate. Not because they're large, but because they're effortless. Because the easier a decision becomes to repeat, the less you think about it. And the less you think about it, the more it becomes part of your baseline, something you no longer evaluate, something you no longer question, until eventually, your income isn't something you control. It's something that gets distributed, automatically, across systems you didn't consciously design, but now depend on. And at that point, it's no longer about individual choices. It's about structure. By the time this pattern is fully in place, it no longer feels like something you're choosing. It feels like something you are, your routine, your preferences, your lifestyle. And that's what makes it so difficult to question, because nothing about it feels wrong. In fact, most of it feels earned. You worked for it. You can afford it. It improves your day, even if only slightly. So the mind does something predictable. It stops evaluating. It stops asking whether something is necessary and starts assuming that it is. And once that shift happens, awareness disappears. Not completely, but just enough. Enough that small decisions no longer register as trade-offs. They register as defaults. And defaults are powerful, because they don't require energy. They don't require attention. They just happen, repeatedly. Which means the system doesn't need you to make bad decisions. It only needs you to stop noticing them. And over time, that's exactly what happens. Because the brain isn't designed to track slow change. It reacts to spikes, to sudden loss, to visible disruption. But this isn't any of those. This is gradual, quiet, consistent. And that's why it works. Not because it's aggressive, but because it's invisible. Individually, none of this feels significant. That's the assumption everything depends on, because each decision is measured in isolation. A few dollars, a small upgrade, a minor convenience, nothing that appears capable of changing an outcome. But compounding doesn't evaluate decisions that way. It doesn't care how something feels in the moment. It only responds to three things: frequency, consistency, and time. And when those three align, small becomes structural. A recurring expense doesn't stay small because it repeats. A decision made once doesn't stay in the past because it continues to draw from the future. And this is where the shift happens. Not when something becomes expensive, but when it becomes permanent. Because permanence turns cost into direction. Every repeated outflow isn't just money leaving, it's money that no longer has the chance to accumulate. And over time, that absence begins to take shape, not as a visible loss, but as something missing, something that should have been there, but isn't. And the longer the pattern runs, the less reversible it becomes. Because compounding works both ways. It builds, or it erodes, quietly, consistently, without asking for permission. At some point, the realization isn't dramatic. There's no moment where everything suddenly becomes clear. It happens more quietly than that. You start noticing things you didn't notice before. Not the big decisions, but the small ones, the ones that repeat, the ones that feel automatic. And instead of asking, "Can I afford this?" you begin to ask something different. What does this commit me to? Because that's the real cost. Not the number attached to the purchase, but the structure it creates afterward. How much of your future income is now spoken for? How much flexibility has already been removed? And how many of those commitments are stacked on top of each other? You begin to see that most decisions aren't isolated. They connect, they reinforce, they build on each other until they form a system. And once you see that system, you can't unsee it. Because now, every choice carries context, not just what it gives you today, but what it takes from you over time. And that awareness doesn't force you to change immediately. It doesn't remove the structure overnight. But it does something more important. It gives you a point of control, in a place where you didn't realize one existed. At that point, the question changes. Not, how do I fix everything, but where is the pressure actually coming from? Because once you see the structure, you realize something important. Most outcomes aren't driven by what you occasionally do, but by what repeats. So the goal isn't to control every decision. It's to interrupt the ones that quietly repeat without being seen. To reintroduce friction where it has been removed, to slow down the automatic, to create space between impulse and action. Not to restrict, but to regain visibility. Because when you can see a decision clearly, you can evaluate it. And when you can evaluate it, you can choose differently. Not perfectly, not all at once, but consistently enough to change direction. And direction is what compounds. Not intention, not awareness alone, but the structure that forms from repeated behavior over time. And once that structure begins to shift, so does the outcome. Most people won't notice this happening, because nothing about it feels urgent. There's no warning, no moment that forces attention, just a gradual alignment, or misalignment, with how the system actually works. And by the time it becomes visible, It's no longer about what went wrong. It's about what has already been set in motion. If this changed how you see your own situation, then you're starting to see the pattern. Not the surface, but the structure underneath it. And once you see that, you begin to recognize it everywhere.